There are moments in history when a quiet room becomes a crucible. No audience, no headlines, just minds, different, defiant, brilliant, gathered around a single question. What is a mind? How does it think? How does it communicate, adapt, and survive? And if we can understand that, could we build one? From 1946 to 1953, in a series of small, invitation-only meetings in New York City, some of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century came together to discuss a radically new vision of life, machines, and meaning. Mathematicians, engineers, neurologists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, cyberneticians. Their fields were different. Their vocabularies often clashed. But their goal was shared: to find the common rules that governed brains, machines, societies, and organisms, to map out the mathematics of purpose, to define feedback, to quantify thought. These gatherings would become known as the Macy Conferences, a name now legendary in the history of systems science, cognitive theory, and artificial intelligence. The participants didn't always agree. In fact, they often didn't understand one another. But what emerged was something entirely new: cybernetics. Not just a science of control and communication, but a framework for seeing everything: machines, humans, institutions, as systems exchanging information. The Macy Conferences seeded entire disciplines: cognitive science, systems theory, computational neuroscience, theoretical biology, and of course, artificial intelligence. The very language we use today: input, output, feedback, learning, information, all finds roots in these conversations. Even now, when we discuss alignment, autonomy, and emergent behavior in machines, we are still echoing ideas first hammered out in those quiet Manhattan rooms. In this episode, we revisit those meetings. We'll trace the intellectual paths of Warren McCulloch, Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, Claude Shannon, and many others, and examine how their cross-disciplinary dialogues formed the basis of how we think about thinking. This story is not one of sudden discovery. It's a story of convergence, of thinkers slowly aligning, sometimes chaotically, around a shared model of mind and machine. And it's a story that might never have been told were it not for the curiosity of one of our own listeners. Special thanks to Matt Phillips 538, who suggested this topic and reminded us that the roots of AI are not just technical. They are human, social, and philosophical. So now we turn the dial back to 1946. The war has just ended. The future is uncertain. And behind closed doors, a new kind of conversation is beginning, one that will reshape how we see minds, machines, and meaning itself. The Macy Conferences did not emerge from nowhere. They were born of a world still reeling from war, intellectually fractured, with scientific fields deeply siloed and urgently looking across disciplinary borders for new methods to repair and understand humanity. In the aftermath of World War II, science found itself in an existential moment. The war had showcased both unparalleled technological triumphs: radar, cryptography, nuclear weapons, and harrowing ethical failures. These twin aspects forced a reckoning. How could such progress coexist with such destruction? Fields like mathematics, physiology, engineering, and anthropology grew increasingly specialized. Collaborations across these domains were limited. the rapidly evolving challenges of mechanized warfare, feedback control in weaponry, communication systems under fire, demanded new, integrated thinking. In 1942, before the formal conferences began, a discreet gathering called the Cerebral Inhibition Meeting took place in Manhattan. Organized by Frank Fremont Smith of the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation and Lawrence K. Frank, it brought together a core of thinkers: Warren McCulloch, neuropsychiatry; Arturo Rosenblueth, physiology; Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, anthropology; and Lawrence Kuby, psychiatry. It was here that Rosenblueth introduced circular causality, systems that loop back on themselves, as a working metaphor for goal-driven behavior in machines and organisms. These ideas captured imaginations and united disciplines around shared concepts of feedback and control. The Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, named after a sea captain but unrelated to the department store, was a philanthropic organization committed to medical research and professional health education. Leaders Francis Fremont Smith and Lawrence K. Frank saw an opportunity. Inspired by that 1942 meeting and increasingly aware of scientific fragmentation, they pushed to formalize these discussions. The goal: foster genuine interdisciplinarity for tackling systemic problems. By 1946, with war over, the groundwork was laid for a new kind of scientific conversation. Warren McCulloch, chair, a neuropsychiatrist with an MD from Columbia and a Harvard-trained mathematician, became the intellectual catalyst. His earlier work with Walter Pitts on threshold models of neurons had already demonstrated that simple networks could replicate Boolean logic. He, along with MIT and Harvard colleagues, helped lure other disciplinary leaders. That March, the first Macy Conference on feedback mechanisms and circular causal systems in biological and social systems gathered an unprecedented cast of minds, including Warren McCulloch, Norbert Wiener, mathematician; John von Neumann, mathematician and computer pioneer; Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, anthropology; Ross Ashby, psychiatry/cybernetics; Walter Pitts, mathematical logic; and later Claude Shannon would join, his mathematical theory of communication adding a new level of rigor. The explicit purpose: to forge a general science of the workings of the human mind by bringing together cognitive, physiological, mathematical, and social viewpoints. This first conference did more than impress its attendees. It cemented a collaborative ethos. It began outlining concepts that would define cybernetics: feedback loops, communication channels, goal-oriented systems in biology and machines. These were the ideas that would evolve into defining terms: input, output, steering mechanisms, noise versus signal, control architectures. Though the group included anthropologists and psychiatrists, the fundamental building blocks were mathematical and systems-based. The true essence of the Macy Conferences began to emerge in the initial gatherings chaired by Warren McCulloch. Rooted in that inaugural 1946 meeting, feedback mechanisms and circular causal systems in biological and social systems, this was where the crucial cross-disciplinary exchanges truly ignited. The core group assembled by McCulloch and organizer Frank Fremont Smith comprised leading figures spanning multiple fields: Warren McCulloch, neuropsychiatrist and mathematician; Arturo Rosenblueth, physiologist and Wiener protege; Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, anthropologists; Lawrence Kuby, psychiatrist; Ralph Gerard, neurophysiologist; Paul Lazarsfeld, sociologist; Molly Harrower, clinical psychologist; Julian Bigelow, electrical engineer; Heinz von Foerster, biophysicist. Guests included giants of logic and mathematics: John von Neumann, Walter Pitts, Norbert Wiener, Leonard Savage, and later Claude Shannon. The foundational idea of circular causality, feedback loops governing purposeful behavior, came from Arturo Rosenblueth's 1942 work with Wiener and Bigelow. At Macy 1946, he explained it as a process of dynamic feedback that created goal-directed behavior without future anticipation, a model applicable to both machines and organisms. This concept resonated profoundly with Bateson and McCulloch, prompting Margaret Mead later to recount how she was so absorbed she broke a tooth without noticing. McCulloch presented his groundbreaking model of neural networks, binary threshold neurons capable of Boolean logic. He described how such networks could form self-sustaining loops, contributing to memory and even hallucinatory behavior. He also introduced the notion that communication within the brain can be modeled, distinguishing message mechanics from meaning. This presentation planted key seeds for cognitive neuroscience and computational models of thought. A notable tension arose between analog perspectives, brain as continuous systems, perception, Gestalt ideas, and digital logic, binary, discrete, networked. An early clash occurred when neurophysiologist Joseph Bremer emphasized analog only for McCulloch and Pitts to counter it with digital formalisms. Psychologist Molly Harrower and physiological psychologist Heinrich Kluver contributed insights into perception and constancy, further emphasizing the perceived analytical divide. Gregory Bateson challenged the group with social science questions, distinguishing learning from learning to learn, pondering whether machines could develop meta-learning. Kurt Lewin introduced field theory from Gestalt psychology, reframing how to model human behavior in social systems. Like many others, Wiener and von Neumann speculated that feedback and control theories could apply to economics and politics, though no experts from those fields were present. These discussions meant to forge a shared meta-language capable of uniting various disciplines under a common framework. What emerged from that initial meeting was remarkable: a shared model of feedback, circular causality, neural logic, and the beginnings of systems language. Most of the central themes of cybernetics, purpose, information, control, learning loops, were introduced by the end of the first 2 days. McCulloch's closing, and Fremont Smith's reminder, was purposeful. This gathering itself was an experiment in interdisciplinarity. If these unfamiliar experts found meaning in one another's perspectives, the journey would continue, and indeed it did. Insight and significance. Rosenblueth's circular causality introduced teleological feedback loops across systems. McCulloch's neural nets demonstrated Boolean logic in brain modeling. Analog versus digital debate shaped ongoing tension in modeling minds. Meta-language challenge prompted a shared interdisciplinary lexicon. Conference as experiment. The method became as important as the message. This pivotal first circle, driven by McCulloch's vision, laid the groundwork for what would become a new, profoundly integrative science: cybernetics. With the early concepts of feedback, circular causality, and neural logic planted in those initial Macy sessions, the conferences began to crystallize into a recognizable new field: cybernetics. By the late 1940s, voices like Norbert Wiener, Claude Shannon, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and Heinz von Foerster were shaping its foundational grammar. In 1948, MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener published Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, formally naming and defining the field. Building on his World War II work with anti-aircraft systems and guided missiles, Wiener described cybernetics as the study of steersmanship, how systems regulate behavior through feedback. He introduced key ideas: feedback loops and oscillation, equivalence between nervous systems and machines, the difference between noise and signal in communication systems. These concepts echoed and amplified earlier Macy dialogues, in example, Rosenbluth and McCulloch, and quickly became foundational for the conferences. While Wiener synthesized feedback, Claude Shannon was quantifying it. His 1949 work, The Mathematical Theory of Communication, reframed communication as a probabilistic system, introducing entropy, a measurable uncertainty in a message, redundancy and noise, and how systems cope, a formal method to analyze any channel, biological or electronic. At the Macy Conferences, particularly by the later sessions, Shannon's information theory became a guiding lens to assess signal flow, error correction, and the meaning embedded in messages. No discussion of cybernetics is complete without Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, whose anthropological insight introduced a vital element: the observer. Bateson coined metacommunication, 1951, showing that communication includes signals about how to interpret other signals. Together with Mead, he pressed the conferences to embrace reflexivity. The observer is part of the system, not an external watcher. This idea, discussed in abstracts and transcripts, planted the seeds for second-order cybernetics, a discipline concerned with how systems include observers as participants. Heinz von Forster, a physicist and early attendee, emphasized the importance of community in constructing meaning. The Macy Group was more than a conference. It was becoming a thought collective, a network of thinkers advancing shared systems ideas. Von Forster later went on to establish the Biological Computer Laboratory, where ideas generated in Macy sessions matured into further cybernetic research. By the conference's midpoint, a distinctive lexicon had emerged, including feedback, information loop enabling system self-correction, Wiener; observer, the act of observation shapes outcomes, Mead, Bateson; message and meta-message, Bateson's "This is play" framing of messages; entropy and noise, Shannon's measures of signal uncertainty; black box, systems analyzed by inputs and outputs, observers outside. This shared vocabulary enabled participants, from engineers to sociologists, to talk past disciplinary boundaries. Cross-field collaborations, ecology and biology. G. Evelyn Hutchinson and Ross Ashby explored how living systems maintain stability. Sociology. Mead and Bateson applied cybernetic ideas to cultural systems and social learning. Neural networks and AI. McCulloch and Pitt's earlier models gained renewed traction as automata theory expanded. This cross-pollination also led to growing tensions. Some, like McCulloch and Wiener, favored quantitative formal models. Others, like Bateson, Mead, and Kubi, urged a more qualitative, reflexive approach. By the late 1940s, cybernetics had become more than theory. It was a shared methodology. As historian S.G. Collins noted, the conferences sought a universal language of information, feedback, and homeostasis to model everything from cells to societies. Cybernetics didn't just bridge disciplines, it invited participants to observe themselves inside their own systems. In that sense, The Macy Conferences were both the birthplace of cybernetics and its first laboratory. In summary, Wiener's 1948 book codified cybernetics, defining control and feedback. Shannon's theory of communication introduced mathematical precision to signal analysis. Mead and Bateson insisted the observer must be included, leading toward second-order cybernetics. Von Forster's thought collective gave cybernetics a social structure beyond papers. A common vocabulary around feedback, observer, entropy, and black box systems became the glue of the field. Lawrence Kuby, a psychiatrist present from the first conference onward, linked cybernetic rhythms to neurosis. He described compulsive, repetitive behaviors as feedback loops that lock in psychiatric states, prompting intense critique from harder science attendees who demanded mechanistic explanations instead of psychoanalytic metaphors. Kuby's persistence opened debates on whether mental illness could be reframed as system dysregulation, and whether machines might one day model or replicate such loops. In March 1952, at the 9th Macy Conference, W. Ross Ashby presented his homeostat, a pioneering adaptive machine built from electromechanical components that demonstrated ultra-stability, adjusting its internal parameters to maintain equilibrium amid changing external inputs. While he attended only this one session, his work became legendary, spotlighting how cybernetic concepts could yield prototype brains, self-correcting systems capable of basic learning and adaptation. Walter Pitts, the brilliant co-author, with McCulloch, of the first mathematical model of a neuron, brought formal logic into psychiatry and cognition discussions. He maintained that mental processes could be rendered as logical operations within networked neurons. Yet suffering deep disillusionment, Pitts burned his doctoral thesis on probabilistic neural nets and withdrew from the field following a fallout with Wiener. He died in 1969, his brilliance shadowed by personal tragedy and alcoholism. Heinrich Klüver spotlighted perceptual constancy, how our brains maintain stable views of objects despite sensory flux, marking an early intersection between cybernetics and Gestalt psychology. Bateson, Kuby, and others pushed questions like learning to learn and how does consciousness arise, illuminating early themes in metacognition. By 1950s to 51, the Macy Group focused on the notion of the human operator as part of the control loop, not merely an external agent. One striking example, John Stroud pointed out that radar gunner systems included humans within feedback loops, but Frank Fremont Smith retorted that observers affect systems just by observing. Such debates about reflexivity crystallized the idea of second-order cybernetics, which recognizes that systems observe and model themselves. Topic and short insight. Psychiatric feedback. Neurosis as feedback dysfunction. Kuby's controversial framing. Homeostat. Ashby's adaptive loop machine as proto-cognitive ultra-stability. Logical brains. Pitts's neurologic models and personal decline. Perception and Gestalt. Brain's constancy mechanisms and early meta-learning discussions. Reflexive observer. Humans seen as part of cybernetic loops. Second-order perspective. This shows how cybernetics pushed deep into the human mind, redefining disorders, emphasizing adaptive control, crafting mathematical analogs to thought, and sowing seeds for cognitive science and AI. As the final Macy Conferences wrapped in 1953, the symposium ended, but its ripples had barely begun. What started as a tight-knit discourse on feedback, information, and mind-machine parallels blossomed into foundational pillars for countless disciplines. After 1953, the core Macy participants forged new paths: computer science and AI, John von Neumann's automata theory, and McCulloch Pitt's neural nets became cornerstones of emerging AI. The 1956 Dartmouth workshop officially launched AI as its own field, separating from cybernetics. Control theory and engineering. Norbert Wiener's engineering cybernetics integrated feedback into electrical and mechanical systems. This branch evolved into modern systems and controls engineering. Second-order cybernetics. Warren McCulloch and Heinz von Foerster advanced reflexive systems theory, leading to constructivist epistemology and influencing later thinkers like Maturana and Varela. Social and cognitive sciences. Bateson and Mead extended cybernetic thinking into anthropology, sociology, and family therapy. Work carried on by organizations like the American Society for Cybernetics. Institutional aftershocks. Labs and professional societies. Biological Computer Laboratory, BCL. Founded in 1958 at the University of Illinois by von Foerster, BCL became a nucleus for second-order cybernetics through the 1960s hinga mid-1970s. American Society for Cybernetics, ASC. Established in 1964, ASC carried the Macy spirit forward, promoting reflexive systems thinking amid Cold War tensions and positioning itself as a mirror to systems engineering groups like the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE. Meanwhile, systems theorists like Ludwig von Bertalanffy and Kenneth Boulding founded the Society for General Systems Research in 1954, drawing on Macy-style interdisciplinarity and shaping fields from ecology to organizational science. Technological legacy and cognitive echoes. Adaptive machinery. William Ross Ashby's homeostat proved cybernetic principles in action, a self-correcting machine brain that inspired robotics and homeostatic system design. Its demonstration at Macy in 1952 captured imaginations and influenced future work. Early AI and connectionism, neural network models from McCulloch Pitts and Shannon's adaptive maze-solving rat created niche prototypes of proto-AI agents, laying groundwork for connectionist revival decades later. Complexity and systems thinking. Cybernetics seeded ideas now central to systems science, feedback, emergence, network theory, impacting everything from ecology to organizational and economic systems. By the 1960s, disciplinary pressures turned cybernetics into several institutional fragments. Computer science and AI took the mathematical trajectory. Engineering cybernetics matured into control engineering. Second-order cybernetics and constructivist epistemology drove philosophical inquiry. Social cybernetics treated societies and families as systems. General systems theory sought universal frameworks across biological, social, and technical systems. Despite its fragmentation, cybernetics never went extinct. It resurged in the later 20th century through complexity science, cognitive neuroscience, and embodied AI, bearing Macy's influence in every domain it touched. The Macy Conferences are easy to overlook in the story of artificial intelligence. There were no great inventions unveiled, no world-changing algorithms written, no prototypes revealed. But what did emerge was, in many ways, even more profound. A new language for thinking about thought. A grammar for minds and machines alike. These meetings gave rise to the idea that systems, whether biological, mechanical, or social, could be understood not just by their parts, but by their patterns. Feedback, information, communication, control. These weren't just technical terms, they were bridges. They connected disciplines that had never truly spoken before: psychiatry and mathematics, anthropology and engineering, biology and logic. And from these bridges emerged new sciences: cognitive science, systems theory, computer science, artificial intelligence. The legacy of the Macy Conferences is not a single paper or discovery. It is a method, a mindset, to think across boundaries, to understand systems from within, to include the observer, to never study a mind without also studying the context it lives in. Today, as we build machines that reason, adapt, and even learn, we're still echoing ideas born in those post-war hotel rooms. We're still asking what it means to think, to adapt, to be aware of awareness. And perhaps most importantly, we're still learning that intelligence, artificial or otherwise, is never isolated. It's always embedded in something larger: a feedback loop, a culture, a context, a system. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Macy Conferences, the quiet origin of ideas that still shape how we build and understand the minds of tomorrow. And special thanks again to Matt Phillips 538 for suggesting this story. We'll see you in the next episode.